We've explored for loops in JS, but we also have while loops at our disposal. Let's examine the while loop by converting our for loop that printed names in an array to a while loop. Rather than placing all the logic for setting up a counting variable, a limit for that variable, and by how much that variable increases with an iteration within one line, while loops allow us to separate that logic into 3 distinct lines. First up, let's console.log our original for loop and just keep it as a reference by commenting it out and doing command / as a shortcut. There we go. Now start by declaring I as the counting variable and set it to 0. Then we'll add a while loop, which just uses the while keyword. Then we'll say while I is less than the length of our names array, we'll console.log names of I, similar to the for loop above, and then we'll iterate by 1 each time. We'll save, and boom, we see Frodo, Sam, Mary, and Pippin, the exact same result as we had in our earlier for loop, but except this time, we're separating each of these separate statements onto 3 distinct lines with the while loop. Awesome. Now, what would happen if we removed the increment? Suddenly, we see Frodo logging over and over again in our console because the value of I never changes. We call this an infinite loop because it never stops and the limit is never met. Now I'm going to go ahead and fix this right away, and you'll notice that I don't even have access to this console. I can't even type anymore, which just goes to show you how dangerous an infinite loop is within JavaScript. Let's go ahead and copy this link. I'm going to close, reload, inspect the element. And there we go. We see a nice, say, Frodo, Sam, Mary, and Pippin again. All right, so that illustrated an infinite loop because the condition is never breached. It just runs the code over and over again without ever stopping. So it's important in while loops not to forget to increment your counting variable. That way you can ensure that an infinite loop never happens. Let's examine one more loop, which is just the while loop again, but a slight variation, the do while loop. Do while loops look very similar to while loops, except they make sure to execute the block of code at least once before evaluating the condition. Let's convert our regular while loop to a do while loop. Just as before, we need a starting counting variable, and then we need to have an opening do keyword with a coding block that executes while our counting variable is followed by a certain condition. So we say do this block of code while our condition is now I is less than names.length. Looks very similar, also has the while loop, but is slightly different because we execute this once before checking the condition. Now we can explicitly show the slight difference between the while loop and the do while loop by checking if I is less than 0. In this case, Frodo is at least executed once, even though I is never less than 0. So if I compare it to the equivalent while loop now, let's comment out this code. We'll say, while I is less than 0, attempt to console.log names I, and you guessed it, nothing will show up in our console. There we go, it's gone. Now from this example, you can see that the do while loop executes whatever is in its coding block at least once before checking the condition, whereas the while loop checks a condition first before even going to the coding block. So on that note, remember to avoid infinite loops because it will crash your program. Luckily, most browsers are well made enough to isolate the crash to just one web page and not kill the whole browsing application for all your other open tabs in Windows. But that still means you have to be careful. You don't want your program to crash if someone's using it. Regardless, while in for loops will make your JavaScript programs much more sophisticated and able to handle large outputs and multiple tasks efficiently. Excellent work!